everyone. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here and talk about my research. So I think my passion and goal in research is to try to understand how children form a self-image, how they construct an identity or a sense of self, and how they use input from their social environment. Their parents, their teachers, their peers, and how messages that they get become internalized, and how children use those messages to find out who they are and what they want to achieve in life. So the title of my talk is The Praise Paradox. I'm going to talk about how well-intended words can inadvertently backfire. By the way, feel free to interrupt me if something is unclear, but we do have some time at the end also to have a general discussion. So the way we raise our children has changed quite dramatically over the past few decades. In fact, I was surprised to find out that the word parenting didn't even exist in US dictionaries until 1958. In fact, it didn't even become common until the 1970s. So this is Google Ngram, which you can use to find out how often a word is used in English literature. So you can see it starts to rise from the 70s. So, well, the question is, what happened in the 70s? So one of the important things that happened around that time is the self-esteem movement. From that time onwards, parents, teachers, and other adults and professionals have become increasingly concerned about raising children's level of self-esteem, to make them feel good about themselves. At that time, the belief was that low self-esteem was at the heart of many very important problems in society, and that perhaps the single solution to all of those problems would be to raise self-esteem. And according to them, perhaps the easiest and most effective way to raise self-esteem is by giving children lots of praise. And this is a belief that's very pervasive and still exists in society. So a few years ago, I administered a survey to Dutch parents, and a large majority of them said that children actually need praise in order to feel good about themselves, which I think is quite a dramatic statement, because they say that without praise, children would never be able to feel good about themselves, something that they need. And a question that I've become more and more interested in is, do these practices actually work, or could they have had an unintended consequence? If you look at the slide, you can see that it might have an unintended consequence. So this is a study that has shown that the level of narcissism has increased quite dramatically since the 1970s. So what these researchers did, they looked at studies that have been conducted on US universities, looked at the mean level of narcissism scores of the students that participated, and the year in which the study was conducted. And as you can see here, the more recently the study was conducted, the higher the level of narcissism. In the 1970s, there was an historian, Christopher Lasch, who already predicted that we might be creating a culture of narcissism. And there's been in Time magazine has labeled the current generation as the me generation. So the question that I'm interested in is, are parents inadvertently raising narcissism rather than self-esteem? Is this very healthy intention in parents to raise children's self-esteem translating in behaviors that could inadvertently raise narcissism? So in this presentation, I'm going to show you some evidence that parents are sometimes indeed raising narcissism, whereas they want to be raising self-esteem. But it is possible to raise self-esteem without raising narcissism. But it's something that requires thought and care. So what is narcissism? Psychologists have defined it in many different ways. Some have said that narcissism is a form of inflated self-esteem, exaggerated self-esteem, excessive self-esteem, unwarranted self-esteem. So there's a gap between, what you think you are and what you actually are. And overly high self-esteem. And all these definitions kind of suggest that there's this continuum of self-esteem, and at the very end, there's a high level of narcissism. So narcissism is a form of high self-esteem according to these psychologists. But if that's true, if narcissism is truly a form of high self-esteem, then we should be seeing two things in the scientific evidence, in the literature. We should see that narcissism and self-esteem are strongly correlated. They should go hand in hand. And if narcissism is really a form of high self-esteem, it's impossible to be narcissistic and at the same time have low self-esteem. So this group of individuals, narcissists with low self-esteem, should not exist. And both of these predictions are wrong. So if you look at the correlation between narcissism and self-esteem, it's very, very low. And in fact, if you use very valid measures, the correlation doesn't exist. And there are statistical techniques that you can use to identify subgroups of individuals based on their scores of self-esteem and narcissism. And if you look at the size of these groups, the group of narcissists who have high self-esteem is about the same size as the group of narcissists who have low self-esteem. So these constructs seem to be almost completely independent. So one study that I think illustrates this really well is, I think it's a really creative study. They asked people to administer a narcissism, to complete a narcissism questionnaire. By the way, you can measure narcissism by self-report. People have been skeptical of measuring narcissism by self-report because they thought that if you're a little bit narcissistic, you would never admit to being narcissistic, right? But as it turns out, people who are a bit narcissistic are actually proud of being narcissistic. So in fact, if you ask them to describe their ideal personality, they basically describe like a character of themselves. So, for instance, in one study, they will ask like, are you someone who gets in arguments a lot? Are you someone who's arrogant? They say, yes, of course, I get into fights a lot, I'm a bit arrogant. And so what's your ideal personality? And then they say, I want to get into even more fights, and I want to be even more arrogant. So you can measure narcissism just by asking individuals to rate statements such as, I'm a very special person, or I deserve to be a leader of a group, for instance. So in this study, they measured narcissism in students, and then they attached everyone to a lie detector. It was a bogus lie detector, but it didn't tell them. So they told them, with this machine, we can see if you are being honest or not, whether or not you're telling the truth or not. In one condition, they told the participants that the lie detector was turned on. In the other condition, participants were told that it was turned off. When it was turned off, the ones who were narcissistic said that they had high self-esteem. Of course I like myself. It's very hard not to like myself. But in the condition in which the machine was turned on, there was no correlation whatsoever between narcissism and self-esteem. So sometimes maybe someone who's narcissistic, who thinks he's superior to other people, might come across as someone who is satisfied with who he is as a person, but this can be an attempt to make an impression on other people rather than something that's felt or experienced genuinely by that individual. So over the past few years, I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which narcissism and self-esteem are different. And what I think is the core difference between these two forms of self-view or forms of self are is the beliefs that people have about who they are, who other people are, and how they relate to other people. If you look at individuals with self-esteem, with high self-esteem, they think they are worthy intrinsically as a human being. They also think that other people are also intrinsically worthy, and that the relationships that they want to form with other people are on an equal plane. Like, they want to get along with other people, they want to fit in, they don't necessarily want to get ahead, they don't necessarily want to stand out. So according to them, social relationships are non-zero sum. We can both be successful, we can both get what we want, there's no competition. Oh, there's something wrong with the slides, I think. So it is showing on, oh, there it is. Okay, great. So if you look at individuals who score higher narcissism, they don't necessarily like themselves, they don't necessarily think that they are worthy. They think that they are superior to other people. And they see other people as below them. In some cases as means to get praise, to get admiration. And they perceive social relationships as zero-sum games. They want to stand out from other people. They want to get ahead of other people. So it's impossible for two individuals in the same relationships to be successful. It's always my failure is your success and your success is my failure. So by understanding these subtle differences between narcissism and self-esteem, we can start to think about ways in which we can help children develop a healthy form of self-esteem without raising this level of narcissism. So people often ask me, isn't it good to be a little bit narcissistic in modern society? Because the individuals that we see in the media that are successful also typically have a pretty big ego. But I think those are the successful people who actually seek out the media to get their story out there, whereas the more modest ones with healthy self-esteem stay quiet. So if you look at self-esteem, individuals with self-esteem feel pretty secure. They feel satisfied with themselves, and that's not very contingent upon how well they do in school, whether they have a lot of money or not. It's pretty unconditional. They're very motivated to help other people achieve their goals. And by establishing collaborative relationships with other people, they also benefit the common good. So I think this is something you can definitely see in the classroom. Oh, same problem. Okay, there it is. So someone with a high level of narcissism is pretty fragile. So when someone who's narcissistic gets the praise and admiration that he or she wants, there's a lot of pride and a feeling of satisfaction. But whenever the praise or admiration is lacking, there's a deep feeling of shame that can turn into anger and aggression. So you see that when, even from childhood onwards, when narcissistic individuals experience are in a shameful situation, they get angry, whereas other people would typically feel bad about themselves. So they externalize the feelings of shame that they have. And what you can see in research also, that narcissists want to take everything for themselves. So let's say in group processes, they claim credit for successes and want to dismiss their contribution to failures. So they can harm the common good. So based on these findings, I want to develop programs that can help kids develop higher self-esteem without making them narcissistic, to try to help them feel more secure about who they are, to help them be more prosocial towards others, and to help them contribute to the common good. So narcissism and self-esteem are forms of self-views that typically emerge around the age of 7. So of course the origins of these processes emerge at a much younger age, but at the age of 7, children are able to form global evaluations of themselves. When you ask younger children to describe themselves, they often talk about very observable, concrete aspects. Let's say, I have nice blonde hair, I can play soccer really well, I'm a nice brother, I'm a nice sister, something you can see and touch. But from the age of 7, children are able to form these very global evaluations, like, I like myself as a person. And from this age, children start using social comparisons for the purpose of self-evaluation. So sometimes when I'm in the classroom full of like 4-year-olds and I ask them, who's the best drawer in the classroom, like 50% raises his or her hand, and they see no conflict whatsoever in those statements. But from the age of 7, children know that these social comparison processes influence their own judgments about themselves. So why do some children develop healthy self-esteem, whereas other children develop narcissism? So why do some children like themselves for who they are, whereas others think that they are better than others without necessarily liking themselves? So there are two broad theories about the origins of narcissism. One is a social learning perspective, which holds that children typically become more narcissistic when they are overvalued by their parents, when their parents think that their child is more special and more entitled than others. And you can imagine when children get this message day in, day out, they gradually internalize it and form this narcissistic view of themselves. So this is one perspective. But there's another perspective out there which says that no, narcissism emerges from a lack of warmth and acceptance. So according to this theory, narcissism is almost like a defense mechanism, something that kids develop when they feel like they are not loved enough by their parents, so they put themselves on a pedestal to obtain from other people the approval they never got from their parents. So I wanted to test these two theories against each other, but at the time there was no research on what overvaluation actually was. Freud was the first person to write about this concept of overvaluation. He observed in his 1914 paper on narcissism, he observed that some parents, his words, are under a compulsion to ascribe every perfection to their child, and to conceal and forget all his shortcomings. According to Freud, this overvaluation refers to this idea, this unrealistically positive perception of your child. We developed a parental overvaluation scale. It's a very brief self-report questionnaire that you can administer to parents to index their level of overvaluation. It has items such as, let's see, number 2, my child deserves special treatment. Number 5, my child is more special than other children. And one that I find especially interesting but also a little bit concerning is number 4. I would find it disappointing if my child was just a regular child. So it is, so overvaluation refers not only to the belief that your child is special and stands out from others, but also that the parent's affection depends on it. So when children don't live up to this idealized image that parents have, parents feel disappointed, maybe also a little bit ashamed. So some people say, isn't this extremely rare? Well, we administer this scale in Dutch parents as well as American parents, and typically the mean levels are around midpoint of the scale. So it's pretty normally distributed, which means that most parents overvalue their child a little bit, but there are large individual differences. So some parents are on one end of the spectrum and other parents on other ends of the spectrum. So one question that we were interested in when we started out with this research was, so what characterizes the parents who overvalue? And the prediction that we had was maybe the parents who overvalue are also maybe a little bit narcissistic themselves. Freud had this observation where he said that if we look at the attitude of affectionate parents towards their children, we have to recognize that it is a revival and reproduction of their own narcissism. So what we did, we measured parental overvaluation, we measured parents' own narcissism and self-esteem levels, and we found that the parents who are most likely to overvalue are also the ones who have narcissistic views of themselves. And I think there are several explanations for this. So one possibility is that parents who are narcissistic see their child as an extension of themselves. So if I'm great, my child should also be great. And another one is more subtle. So as you all know, I think narcissistic individuals have this strong desire to be admired. And at least in Dutch society, when you brag about yourself a lot, that's not really accepted. People disapprove of that. But bragging about your child or putting your child on a pedestal instead of yourself is more accepted. So maybe sometimes parents overvalue their child in a very concealed attempt to be admired as a parent of their child. So in the next study, we looked at the mental representations that these overvaluing parents have of their child. So we provided them with 7 figures. We told them the gray circle represents your child, and the white circles represent other children. And I want you to select the figure that best represents how your child compares to others, or how your child relates to others. And as you can see, the size of the gray circle gradually increases with every picture. And we found that parents who were likely to overvalue were the ones who selected figures in which their own child is depicted as bigger, presumably more important than others. So this is a really implicit way of getting at this idea that your child is somehow superior to others. And I'm also interested in this idea that overvaluation refers to an inflated perception. It's detached from reality a little bit. We discovered that parents who overvalue, they overestimate, overclaim, and overpraise children's qualities. So for instance, in one study, we asked parents, how smart do you think your child is? And then we measured children's actual IQ scores with a standardized IQ test. And we discovered that parents who overvalue, they think their child is really smart and stands out from others in terms of IQ. But in reality, the child's IQ score did not differ from those of others. In another study, which was an American sample, we provided parents with a long list of several topics, so items that children should typically be familiar with at the end of elementary school. So items such as Neil Armstrong, Mississippi, Berlin. And the only thing that parents have to do is indicate, is your child familiar with this topic, yes or no? And what parents didn't know was that I actually created terms that didn't actually exist. So I made up some book titles such as The Tale of Benson Bunny, or I think I made up a Turkish king named King Amrabat. And so parents also rated those items. And what we discovered is that parents who are high on overvaluation said, for all these items, yes, of course my child knows this, including the items that don't actually exist. And in another study, we measured parents' overvaluation, and a few days later, we visited them at home. And we asked parents to administer mathematics exercises to their child, also from a standardized IQ test. We videotaped it, and afterwards we looked at how often parents praised their child. And we found that the parents who overvalued, the ones who scored like one standard deviation above the mean, were 62% more likely to praise 62% more often than parents who scored below the mean. Which means, on average, parents praised about every minute. So you can imagine how much that 62% increase actually means. And what fascinated me about this finding is that parents praised regardless of children's actual performance. So even when children didn't do well, parents gave them lots of praise. So in all of these studies, we measured objective characteristics of children because we wanted to find out, is it possible that children who are overvalued by their parents are somehow objectively special, or somehow objectively more likely to be valued? Maybe they have some valuable characteristics that parents see and they adjust their overvaluation based on that. We measured children's temperament, we measured their IQ scores, we measured their mathematics performance, we measured their personality. But we never found a correlation between parents' overvaluation and children's objective characteristics. But we did find that it was related to parents' perceptions of those characteristics. So it seems like parental overvaluation resides within parents' fantasy or within parents' minds, and not necessarily within objective reality. And one finding that adds to that idea is from a study where we looked at the names, the first names that parents gave their child when they were born. So one of the best and easiest ways to make children stand out from other people is by giving them a very unique, uncommon first name. So we asked parents, so well, what's your first name, and how much do you overvalue that child? So they completed our overvaluation scale. And there is a really nice Dutch database that provides the proportion of children born in a specific year for that specific sex with that specific name. And we found that parents who overvalued were more likely to pick names that are relatively unique or uncommon. So these are just some examples from famous people. Like Jason Lee, he called his son Pilot Inspector. Ben Gillette called his daughter Maxi Crime Fighter. And there was a participant in our study whose daughter's name was Vanity, which I think is pretty telling given the topic of the study. So now that we know what parental overvaluation means, we can start asking, so, well, what are the origins of narcissism? Is it this overvaluing type of parenting, or is it the parenting that is characterized by a lack of warmth and affection? So we measured children's self-esteem levels and their narcissism levels at several points in development. And at the very same moment, we also measured parents' level of warmth and affection and their level of overvaluation. And what we discovered was that parents who overvalued, so when children were overvalued by their parents, they were more likely to have a higher narcissism level 6 months later, but not vice versa. So it's not true that narcissistic children somehow encourage or trick their parents into overvaluing them. It's the overvaluation that seems to cultivate this narcissistic belief about the self. There was no effect on self-esteem. So being overvalued, being seen by your parents as someone who is more special than others, more entitled than others, but also with this implicit pressure of living up to that image, those children develop this idea that they are superior to others, but they don't start liking themselves better. So Theodore Millen, he passed away a few years ago, but he was the founding father of this social learning perspective, and he summarized this finding nicely in the 60s already. He said, when overvalued, the child learns to view himself as a special being, learns to expect subservience from others, begins to recognize that his mere existence is sufficient to provide pleasure to others, and that his every action evokes commendation and praise. So I fully agree with this statement, except for the statement that the child knows that his existence is enough to provide pleasure. Because I think narcissistic kids get the very exact opposite message. So when you are overvalued, your parents think that you are this very unique, special individual with these unique talents and abilities. But also with the message that if you don't live up to that image, I will be disappointed in you. Maybe I will feel a little bit ashamed. So I think narcissistic children internalize this idea, yes, I am special, but I have to prove that I'm special to be a worthy person. And that's what you see also in childhood. Narcissistic children, they feel readily ashamed. So when they fail in the eyes of others, when they feel rejected, when they get a low grade in school, they feel bad about themselves. And this might be because they know that they are losing other people's approval of them because they are not living up to the image that other people have of them. So in new research, in ongoing research, we are trying to find out effective ingredients of this overvaluing style of parenting. So what is it that parents overvalue? What is it that they do that makes children develop this narcissistic view of themselves? And one of the candidates might be inflated praise. So inflated praise refers to belief that's to praise that is phrased very positively. So inflated praise contains an adverb or adjective that signals a very positive evaluation. So instead of telling children that they made a nice drawing, parents tell them, you made an incredibly nice drawing. Or instead of telling children that they did a good job, parents tell them, you did an amazing job. And we coded how often parents provide this type of praise in several studies. And what we find consistently is that about 25% of all the praise that parents provide is inflated. So in this study, we conducted observations of parent-child interactions. We counted how often parents provided inflated praise, how often they provided non-inflated, modest praise. And then, right before the observation, but also 6 months later, 12 months later, 18 months later, we measured children's self-esteem levels, as well as their narcissism levels. And what we found is children who had low levels of self-esteem at the start of the study were most likely to get inflated praise from their parents. So parents do this with the best possible intentions. They want to raise children's level of self-esteem, and they want to do that by giving children inflated types of praise. However, as you can see, the more inflated praise that children got, the lower their self-esteem later on in development. So it seems to create this self-reinforcing downward spiral where parents want to raise children's self-esteem, which is a very healthy intention, but they try to do so by giving inflated praise. But rather than making children feel good about themselves, in the long run, it makes them feel bad about themselves. And we also found in a subgroup of individuals, it could also raise narcissism levels. And this was especially true for the ones who started out with a high level of self-esteem. Probably because when you have low self-esteem and you receive inflated praise from your parents, it's really easy to dismiss it. Right? If you don't think you're great, but your parents tell you that you're amazing, you think, yeah, well, maybe they think I'm amazing, but I know I'm not amazing. So when children receive inflated praise, they receive this mixed message, I think. They might get a sense of grandiosity because parents think that they are these amazing individuals. But at the same time, they might be afraid of not being able to live up to this grandiose image. And whenever there's a setback or whenever there's a failure, they feel down about themselves. So it might create this mix of low self-esteem, high narcissism. So Richard Farson, he wrote a really interesting article about praise in the 1960s. And he said the most threatening aspect of praise is the obligation it puts on us to be praiseworthy people. He said if we really believe it when we are told that we are competent or intelligent or beautiful, then we are always on the spot to be competent or intelligent or beautiful. So it can create this pressure of always living up to the image that you think other people have of you. So a colleague of mine, he was playing ping pong with his granddaughter, and it was actually the first time that she ever played this game. And the first game went really, really well, and due to a good bit of luck, she won. And he told her in excitement, "You are so incredibly talented at this." Of course, she was happy and proud. Next day, they played again. But she lost, of course. She ran out of luck. But then she started crying and asked, "Grandpa, did I just lose my talent?" So by attaching her performance to this label of being incredibly talented, children were afraid of losing this label. She was afraid of losing this label whenever she was not able to live up to that expectation or that image. So again, I think this illustrates that we give this type of praise with the best of intentions, but it might have a consequence that we don't anticipate, and that you might not be able to see right away, but only when children experience setbacks, only when there's failure or struggle. So we did a study where we asked kids to copy a Vincent van Gogh drawing, maybe better known as Vincent van Gogh. Whenever I give a presentation in English, people typically know who Van Gogh is, but not who Van Gogh is. So we gave them, this is actually wild roses. So we asked them to copy this drawing, and we told them that we would bring their copy to a professional painter who was waiting in another room. So they completed their drawing. We took their drawing. We went to the other room. Of course, there was no real other painter, but by random assignment, we picked an envelope and we brought it back to the child. And we told children, this envelope contains a message written by the painter for you. So in one condition, the note said, you made an incredibly beautiful drawing. So that's inflated. The word incredibly is in there. In the other condition, the note was identical, except that the word incredibly was missing. So you made a nice drawing. And in the control condition, children got no praise, but they got more a descriptive note like, I received your drawing, I will keep it in my office together with the other drawings. And then we told kids that they were going to make other drawings, but at this time they could choose which ones. They could choose between easy drawings and difficult ones. So we told them, if you pick the easy ones, you probably won't make many mistakes, but you won't learn much either. For the difficult ones, we told them, you might make some mistakes, but you will definitely learn a lot too. So that's a trade-off between performance and learning. And what we found was children who had low self-esteem to begin with, so the ones who receive inflated praise most often from others, were most likely to avoid the difficult drawings and go for the easy ones when they received inflated praise. So a child with low self-esteem is very afraid of losing other people's approval, and when they get inflated praise, they think that other people expect them to do incredibly well, and they might doubt whether they will be able to live up to that image. And rather than taking a risk and trying something difficult, they would much rather not try something difficult and go for the easy tasks. And we found the opposite effect for non-inflated praise. So when you phrase praise in a way that sets a realistic standard, something that feels achievable to someone who has low self-esteem, they might actually be motivated to go for the difficult tasks. They're willing to take the risk. Yeah. No, yeah, sure, go ahead. Oh, sorry, maybe I should have walked you through it. So on the y-axis, so the vertical axis, you see challenge seeking. So the higher that number, the more likely children were to choose to pick difficult tasks. The horizontal axis, the x-axis, you see self-esteem. So the higher the number, the higher the self-esteem. As you can see on the left side of the figure, children with lower levels of self-esteem, when they got inflated praise, which is a solid line, they were least likely to pick the difficult tasks. Yeah. So in this study, we didn't look at the effect on self-esteem, but we examined whether the effect of inflated praise on this desire to do something difficult might depend on children's level of self-esteem. So if you take these findings together, you see that parents have this strong desire and intention to raise children's level of self-esteem, which is a very healthy desire given how important self-esteem is for children's healthy development. However, the means that they use to try to raise self-esteem might not always be effective. In fact, in some cases, they might inadvertently lower self-esteem, and in other cases even raise children's narcissism levels. So the question is, of course, how can parents effectively raise self-esteem rather than narcissism? And this is a question I've become more and more interested in. And we got a few clues from earlier studies. So in the study that I presented earlier, where we looked at the effect of parents' overvaluation on narcissism, we also looked at children's self-esteem levels. And what we discovered is that children develop higher self-esteem when they experience warmth, which is affection, shared interest, shared joy. So parents who are warm and affectionate, they don't necessarily overpraise children. They don't tell them that they are special. They don't tell them that they stand out, or that they should live up to this image to be valuable or to be loved. What they do is they simply share affection. They make children feel valued for who they are as a person. They make children feel that they enjoy their company. They show interest in children's activities. They share joy. And it's completely unrelated statistically to overvaluation. So children with higher levels of parental warmth developed higher self-esteem levels 6 months later. And vice versa. So children with high levels of self-esteem were more likely to experience parental warmth 6 months later. And one possible explanation for this last finding might be, if you have high self-esteem and you think you're worthy as a person, maybe you also expect to be liked by other people. And you are more open and you give other people more opportunities to express this approval and appreciation and affection. So there was no effect on narcissism. So the psychoanalytic perspective that a lack of warmth and affection could raise narcissism was not supported in this study. So what it shows is that when children experience warmth from their parents, they gradually internalize the idea that they are intrinsically worthy individuals, neither superior nor inferior to other people. So in ongoing research, I want to find out what it is in parents' warmth that raises children's self-esteem. And one thing that we are looking at now is maybe parental warmth sends a message of unconditional regard or acceptance. Maybe it makes children feel loved for who they are as a person, regardless of whether they live up to parental expectations. And we're now running studies to test this idea. And Carl Rogers, who is someone who wrote about this idea extensively, he said that unconditional regard represents an atmosphere which simply demonstrates that I care. Not I care for you if you behave thus and so. It's unconditional for who the child is as a person rather than for his achievements or behaviors. So when we think about the topic of this conference, I think one of the important goals that we have as educators and as parents is creating confidence in children to try something that's difficult, to take risks, to be curious, to find out something they don't already know. And the ways that we are intuitively inclined to use to try to raise confidence might not always be effective. So rather than making children stand out from the crowd, rather than labeling them as special or saying that they are very talented, maybe we can create a community in which they feel appreciated for who they are, as part of the group also, but also for them as individuals, without this message that they have to stand out in order to get this sense of approval and recognition. So if we recognize these different types of parenting behaviors, if we recognize the difference between self-esteem and narcissism, and the various socialization experiences that underlie them, maybe we can gradually try to create communities in which children develop higher self-esteem, and not necessarily higher levels of narcissism. Thank you very much.